We are so pleased to have Professor Timothy Snyder here with us this afternoon. He is the Richard Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a member of the Committee on Conscience at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Professor Snyder is the author of several books about Eastern European history and numerous articles about authoritarianism and threats to democracy. His breadth of knowledge about the past serves to help us understand our present condition. I've been trying to get him to speak with us since February of last year. Liz and I read two of his books, Bloodlands and Black Earth, in the summer of 2016. The echoes of events from those books reverberated strongly for us after the 2016 election. In them, he tells the stories of those who were put in the harmful path of Hitler and Stalin because of the demise of their institutions in Eastern Europe and Western Eurasia between World War I and II. Since last year, we all know so much has happened. There's been a continuous assault on our civic lives, the poor, our undocumented residents, our legal system, the whole notion of what truth is and what facts are. We have before us a challenge that will take the sustained energy of all of us to combat. In order to beat back the insidious rise of authoritarianism, we need to recognize the patterns of it, to understand how and where this has occurred elsewhere, as well as in our midst. First, we must learn this from those communities who have been oppressed by the actions of our government in the past. Indigenous people, African Americans, and other people of color, immigrants, union organizers, women, and the patterns of oppression that we have all experienced. As Nancy MacLean pointed out in her book, Democracy in Chains, present-day oligarchs like the Kochs, Mercers, and Waltons among us are seeking to oppress the 99% of us. They're trying to use our government to accomplish their goal of so-called economic liberty at the expense of our civil rights, the due process of law, and therefore our democracy. Professor Snyder's On Tyranny is a concise guidebook through this imperiled time and responds to the challenges that face us from within and without. The Road to Unfreedom puts our present political situation in context with other countries, such as Russia and the Ukraine, so that we can recognize the patterns of speech, behavior, institutional shifts, limits on basic freedoms that put us at risk for becoming an authoritarian state. We of NYCD 16 Indivisible have awakened to these perils and have vigorously fought back against them for the last 15 months. We've taken to heart many of the lessons from On Tyranny, including Lesson 8, Stand Out. It can feel strange to do or say something different, but without that unease, there is no freedom. And Lesson 12, Make eye contact and small talk. This is not just being polite, it's part of being a citizen and responsible member of society. In our work groups, in our community outreach, our electoral canvassing, speaking with our friends and neighbors, we are living the truth of what we want our community and thus our nation to be. This is what drove us to work on behalf of Mr. Dario Sanchez in making scores of calls to our members of Congress and enlisting the specific help of our Congressman Eliot Engel to help prevent his deportation. We have asked for Professor Snyder's guidance to help us take the time to assess where we are now and what challenges the near future hold. Professor Snyder will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes and then answer our questions for 20 to 30 minutes. He will then have a book signing. We thank the voracious reader from Larchmont for coming today and supplying us with books. Please support his coming down. We've met his daughter, Talia, who's off somewhere in the children's section of the library. So, Professor Snyder.
Okay, thank you very much, Eileen, for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. I usually try to wear a suit and tie no matter what the occasion, because I figure like if what I'm going to say is going to be radical, I should try to look like the patriarchy as much as possible. I mean, once I get my hair cut, I can do a pretty good job of that. I'm not doing that this weekend because, as Eileen was nice enough to say, I'm traveling with my daughter, which of course leads to my first thank you, which is gracias a la familia Sanchez for what you had to say. Yo digo gracias a la familia Sanchez, because of course it's from families that politics begin, and it's only in listening to families and beginning with the connections that are most fundamental, we can start to think about what's right and what's wrong. So thank you for this chance to spend a weekend with my daughter and also talk to all of you. My second thanks is to you, to Indivisible, for what you're doing. We started at the same time on Tyranny. It was my immediate reaction to the election. This other big book, The Road to Unfreedom, was actually finished by the time Trump was elected, and I took a year off from Road to Unfreedom, wrote the lessons, wrote the On Tyranny, and then spent a year learning about the United States. Then coming back and writing a final chapter for The Road to Unfreedom, which is about the United States. So these two books are all in a cycle, but there's another cycle, which is me learning from activists and me learning from Americans. The last year has been kind of a homecoming for me, where I tried to bring what I know about the history of Europe to the help of Americans, but then Americans helped me to understand what's going on in this country, so that in Road to Unfreedom I could try to bring it all together. So thank you to you, thank you for what you're doing. What I'd like to do in the half an hour or so that I'm going to speak to you is go through, I think, some of the lessons of On Tyranny, both with an eye to how they help us make sense of what's going on in some sort of historical context, but also with an eye to being more specific about what the particular threats and dangers of this moment in 2018 are. Along the way, I will drag some of the themes of Road to Unfreedom in, because I have this very strong feeling, it only grows stronger, that we can't understand our own problems, as Eileen said, without the advantage of African Americans and immigrants and others who tend to have a sharper vision into the United States, right? Like that's a kind of, that's like, it's like cheating, it helps so much. But likewise, it helps an awful lot to see what's going on as a kind of dark globalization, where some of the phenomena that seem surprising and Americans notice late sometimes happened earlier in places like Russia and Ukraine, and both the structure and the forms of resistance can be useful to know. So I'll refer a little bit to that. But the way I'm going to structure this talk is to go through a few of the lessons of On Tyranny and then talk to you all afterwards. So number one, the most important lesson in On Tyranny, probably the most important historical lesson of the 20th century when it comes to regime change, and it's one that you've gotten right if you're here, is don't obey in advance. Psychologically hugely important, because what we tend to do when a new situation arises is to adapt to it. And 99 times out of 100, that's appropriate. I mean, I was invited to talk, so I'm talking. You know, you were invited to listen, so you're listening. Most of the time, it's appropriate. The trick to being free as an individual or as a society is to recognize that some moments are abnormal, to have the ability to find moments as abnormal and not to adjust, not to obey in advance. And the reason why we know this is historically important, or the reason why historians of the things that I work on, which are the Holocaust and Nazi terror, the reason why we know this is important is that one of the few things that historians agree about when it comes to 1933 and Hitler's rise to power is that in the first year or so, most of the power was conceded voluntarily, because people normalized what was happening around them, adjusted to it, and obeyed in advance. They reached out and tried to find that midpoint between themselves and what they thought the ruler wanted. If you just don't do that, you're already doing a lot. And if you don't do that, you give yourself a chance to do something else. Once you normalize, and I'm sure all of you have observed this just as I have, those folks who normalized back in November, December of 16, it's very hard to come back from that, right? It's very hard to come back. So that's another reason why this lesson is number one. If you get this lesson right, you have a chance to do other things. Number two is the second most important one, I think, is defend institutions, which isn't to say that institutions in the United States are perfect. On the contrary, that's why number three is beware of the one-party state, because of course that's where we're headed. But defend institutions, use institutions that exist, try to avoid the thing which is happening around the world, which is democratic backsliding. So it's not just us. This is all one process. One thing that struck me very clearly in the last couple of years is that you can't make democracy on your own. If we do badly, everyone else does badly, and if other people do better, then we do better. Whether you're on the left or on the right, there is no such thing as America first. It's literally impossible to withdraw from the world. You can choose to ignore the world if you want. You can say on the left, oh, Russia, that's Russia, but we've got problems. That doesn't actually make sense because they're the same problems and the problems are actually interconnected. You can say on the right, America first, we don't care about the world, but that doesn't make sense either, I'm afraid, for the same reasons. It's all one process. So the democratic backsliding is a world trend, which leads me to the third lesson, which is beware the one-party state. Now, where I spend my mental time, the one-party state means fascism, or the one-party state means communism, and I would like to think that those references still have some resonance in America. I think they have less than I think they do, right? I've learned that they have less than I think they do, but there was a reason why we didn't used to like the one-party state, right? There was a reason, and that reason was that the one-party state is totally irreconcilable with freedom as we understand it. But there's something maybe even more fundamental going on, or there's another reason to like having multiple parties, right? And whether it can be two or more, like I'm happy to be agnostic about that. It's just got to be more than one. And for those of, and for there to be three, there first have to be two. I'm just going to make that point. Like for those of y'all who like voting for a third party, I know where you're coming from, but if we get down to one, there ain't going to be three, right? There have to be two before there can be three. Okay. No, that was my little. I try not to get into political tactics too much, but there you go. Now, with the thing about democracy, the reason why democracy is a good thing, or would be a good thing, it's not just that it would lead to better political outcomes. The more democratic a country we were, the better political outcomes we would have, because if you look at public opinion polls, it's actually a much saner country than it appears from the policy outcomes. So the more democratic we would be, the saner the policy outcomes would be, but there's also something more fundamental going on here, which is the climate of politics. The nice thing about democracy, or the good thing about democracy fundamentally, is that it is a succession principle. It means that you know that you can vote for people 1 year, and then you can vote for them again 2 years on, or 4 years on. When that goes away, when the vote goes away, or when you no longer believe the vote matters, the whole atmosphere of politics changes dramatically, right? I mean, the difference between us and Russia is not that they don't have elections, and we do. The difference is that they are much further along on a process where elections are completely ritualized, and where everyone understands that they don't matter. And once elections don't matter, then people don't have a sense of the future. And once you don't have a sense of the future, it becomes totally meaningless to talk about policy, because policy is all about a better future. And when the future is gone, what's left is a politics of us and them in the moment, right? That's what a one-party state ultimately means. It means no policy, no future. It means policy is replaced entirely by discourse of us and them, the real Americans and the not real Americans, right? I mean, in our country, it's the white people then and the blacks, or the immigrants or the Muslims, or maybe the Chinese, or maybe the Jews if it's Tuesday or Thursday. But the basic idea is that politics as policy goes away in a one-party state, and it's replaced entirely by politics as the game of us and them, of inside and outside, where we're supposed to be outraged or elated, but nothing ever happens that might make the situation better. I'm going to move ahead to number 5, which is remember professional ethics. Now, I'm going to start again from what I seem like a dramatic and distant place, which is the 1930s in Eastern Europe. And I'm just going to ask the question, what's a show trial? A show trial is a performance carried out by judges, real judges, right? And real lawyers, and real prosecutors. What is a concentration camp? A concentration camp is a lawless zone, as defined by lawyers, administered by state bureaucrats, used as a place where labor is cheap by businessmen, and a place where experiments are carried out by physicians. That's a concentration camp. In other words, concentration camps are only possible. I wanted to say were, but I didn't. Concentration camps are only possible because people in various professions define the ethics of those professions in certain ways, which makes it all the more important that those of us who are in professions, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, whatever it might be, businessmen and women, that we have some sense of what the ethic of our profession is, and that sense has some resistance to the normalization, gives us some way of reacting. The example of immigration is so central to this, right? Because we are on a slippery slope from immigration to incarceration to lawlessness, which can only be stopped if people, not only if citizens act, which is important, but also if people in various professions say, no, actually, that's not what law means or can mean, or this is not a case I'm willing to prosecute, right? That's absolutely necessary. So, what lawyers do in this country, since we're a country of lawyers, which until recently seemed entirely like a bad thing, but now seems like more of a mixed thing, at least to me. Since we're a country of lawyers, the way lawyers choose to comport themselves actually matters hugely, as we see, right? I mean, we have one lawyer who is, we have Mr. Sessions, who's a lawyer who perjured himself to become the highest law enforcement official in the land. That's a bad example. But we also have lots of good examples of lawyers who are saying, my professional ethics says that I cannot do this, or indeed that I must do this, right? So professional ethics may sound boring and tedious, but professional ethics is one of the things which keeps us away from a complete slippery slope down to lawlessness. Number 6 and number 7, thank you for the water. Number 6 and number 7 are about violence. Number 6 is be wary of paramilitaries, and number 7 is be reflective if you must be armed. Now again, these lessons come right out of Nazi Germany. The way that the German state was transformed from a rule of law state to the very special construction it was by the 1940s was that, on the one hand, paramilitaries were brought into the state, and on the other hand, the police were penetrated by the paramilitaries. And so by the end you had this hybrid, which was neither one nor the other, this very special thing which Himmler designed and which Himmler regarded as his organ of state terror. Now, this may seem very distant, but it's not. Fundamentally, having a normal country or having a state is about a monopoly on violence. It's about the state being the only agent that can use violence, and the state using violence in a just way. Episodes of gun violence in schools are not just isolated and horrific things. They're also a sign that the government is not the government, right? Every single time that happens, it's not just a tragedy and a sign of bizarre policy. It's also a sign that the government is not really the government. And this is one of the reasons why things like this happen, right? It's one of the reasons why certain kinds of paramilitaries tend to greet them rather than to criticize them. So this business of gun control, or this business of controlling violence, is not just a matter of basic human decency. It's also a matter of having a government. It's a matter of sovereignty. Number 8, stand out, is one that you're all doing, so I'm not going to dwell on it. It's the very nice thing about stand out is that it's about freedom. Like, it reminds us what freedom is, which is number 9, be kind to the language. Americans say freedom all the time, right? We abuse the word freedom, we abuse the word liberty. As Eileen, I think, quite aptly said, we as a country have a tendency to reduce freedom and liberty to economic freedom, which actually hollows out the concepts completely, because it means that somebody else's economic freedom means that my children have no chance to not mine in particular, but anybody's children are not going to grow up in a society where they can possibly become individuals, right? Because becoming an individual is a social process. And so the word freedom, like all these words, can be impoverished and we have to use them well. But standing out is connected to using the language, because standing out means putting yourself in an awkward position. It means calling meetings. It means being late for meetings. It means doing things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. It means feeling uncomfortable. And for me, this is a marker. Like, when I look at America in 2018, and I look at the people who are smug and comfortable on television or in real life, I think, damn, those are not free people, right? Those are not free people. If you're smug, if you're smiling smugly at a television camera right now, not only are you not free, you're probably spreading unfreedom to other people. The people who are free are the ones who are leaning out, who are feeling a little bit awkward, who are doing something which requires at least a tiny bit of courage. And a little bit of courage is so much more than none at all. No, it's true. Number 10, believe in truth, and number 11 is investigate. So here, I think a lot of us have picked up on this. It's something that I understood from Russia many years ago, but I think it's become clear in the US as well, that there is an organic relationship between factuality and democracy, or between factuality and the rule of law. If we don't, I mean, it's not that like we have to come to perfect truth, you and I, but rather if we give up on factuality, we're then giving up on a whole lot of other things. Because if we don't have facts, we can't have a discussion about policy, about any policy, right? If we don't have facts, we can't have non-governmental organizations, because what are they acting on if we don't agree about that there's a real world? If we don't have facts, we also can't have law in our sense, because findings of law depend upon findings of fact. So keeping the factual world going is actually extremely, extremely important. And I mean, and this has, I mean, to look at this from abroad, this has it has an integral consequence for our sovereignty as a country, because what the internet has become, right, in many ways what social platforms have become, are a way that domestic and foreign actors, corporate and state, educate the minds of our children and our minds to prevent us from actually ever getting to think about facts. I mean, I wish the internet were what it says it was, but it just ain't. There has been an awful lot of happy talk about what the internet is supposed to be. It is not that thing. In 2016, the internet was, among other things, an instrument whereby corporate and state actors, domestic and foreign, prevented people from having serious discussions about policy by playing on their susceptibilities and weaknesses and creating imaginary scandals and non-events, which drew, unfortunately, a substantial part of the American electorate away from where it might otherwise have been. And this is really serious, right? I mean, that amounts, I think anyway, to losing a war. If you can't have, and I'm not, the Russians think that too, by the way. I mean, they think that they want a war, and they say so all the time if you listen to them in Russian. And I think they're right. I mean, war is about bending the will or breaking the will of the other side. And that's not me, that's Clausewitz, the most important student of war. It's not about combat. Combat's a means to an end. War is about breaking the will of the other side, right? Our will got broken. Can we build it back? Domestically, or maybe both domestically and globally, factuality is absolutely essential to the fight against inequality. The fight against racial inequality, right? If we don't know how many lynchings, how many deportations, if we don't know who, when, and why, we can't talk about it. But also wealth inequality, right? This whole business of the 99% of the 1%, which is of course really it's actually the 0.001%, but this whole business of the 99% and the 1% depends upon our having some facility with the numbers, which depends upon having data and also reporters who report it in a way which is coherent and communicable. It's really striking to me that there's only really one or two places that have a greater wealth inequality problem than we do, and one of them is the Russian Federation. It's really striking how the best reporters in Russia are the ones who cluster around the problem precisely of oligarchy, of wealth concentration, right? And as we become more like Russia, our best reporters are doing the same thing. And what I'm trying to stress is this business of inequality, which colors so much and which is dragging us down in so many ways, depends upon factuality, precisely. We have to have the facts if we're going to address even these most basic issues. So eye contact and small talk, Eileen covered. Practice corporeal politics, Eileen covered. Establish a private life, have a part, try to share more with your friends than you do with the internet, which is actually a pretty high standard, right? It's good for you and it's good for society if you can manage to do that. Contribute to a good cause, you're all doing that. So 16 is learn from peers in other countries. And the reason why this one's so important to me, I already suggested it. It's not just a kind of rhetorical thing to say that we're all in this together. We really are all in this together. There's very little which has happened in the US since 2016, which hadn't already happened in other places, whether it's Poland or Hungary or Russia or Ukraine. As a teacher of East European history, this came home to me early. I teach young people from these countries. And you'll remember that our promise to them, or our declaration after 1989, was that history is over, there are no alternatives to liberal democracy, and all that yada yada. And of course, if you were born after 1989 in that part of the world, that has not been your experience of life at all. In fact, as you've come of age, those promises of liberty and democracy have only seemed less and less credible, which means that a lot of the people I teach, a lot of the students that I have, are people who have come through the kinds of protests and had the kinds of experiences which more and more Americans are trying to have, and I've tried to learn from them. I wrote the first article about Trump and Putin. I broke that story. And the reason I was able to break that story was that I was following the Russian sources. I didn't have any animus about Trump. I mean, as far as I knew, he was just a failed New York real estate developer. Until I learned from, which is of course true, but until I learned from the Russian sources, right? Until I learned from the Russians that he was some kind of hot political property. Right? I mean, this was at a time in late 2015 when he was largely dismissed here or seen as some kind of a character, right? But the Russians were taking him very seriously, right? And so then I thought, okay, if they're taking him seriously, I should probably take him seriously too. And of course, this, I say learn from peers from other countries, but it turns out that it's all one phenomenon. The things that are wrong with US domestic politics turn out to be the avenues by which hostile foreigners can influence us. So, I mean, there are many reasons why it's wrong to have banks carry out anonymous transactions. There are many reasons why it's wrong that you can legally register companies anonymously in 3 American states, right? I mean, there's one building in Delaware which has 285,000 businesses registered at its address. There are many reasons why it's wrong that $7 to $21 trillion are offshored. There are many reasons why it's wrong that real estate transactions can be carried out anonymously, right? Many obvious reasons have to do with social justice and social welfare. But it's precisely those phenomena that I named that allowed a financial and then a political and then a personal relationship to form between Mr. Trump and certain Russian oligarchs. That's how it happened, right? It's all one story. The way the Russians work is what they see in us, right? I mean, the things that we see as being out on the fringe, this offshoring, these shell companies, that's their normal. And they push their normal, they use their normal, and they make us more like them. Mr. Trump is making us more like them, but it comes from our own weaknesses, or the things that we choose not to see ourselves to a really striking degree. And what I try to do in Road to Unfreedom is I try to tell this whole story as one history, right? Where you can make sense of 2016. 2016 will start to make sense if you just start the story in Russia a few years earlier and then work your way towards us. 17 and 18 are listen for dangerous words and be calm when the unthinkable arrives. This is, of course, about the Reichstag fire. Okay, and the Reichstag fire is the way that Hitler goes from being someone who won an election to someone who changes a regime. The Reichstag fire in the authoritarian playbook, which is not on sale here, but which you can find on PDF at a very reasonable price. Thank you for not laughing. In the authoritarian playbook, a Reichstag fire is an event which maybe you engineer or maybe you don't, but an event which is surprising for the population, which allows you to declare a state of exception. You say, this moment is exceptional, we have to suspend the Constitution, you have to give up your civil rights, of course it's temporary, right? Yeah, like 9/11. So the thing about 9/11 is, we now have, I wish I didn't have to say this, it sounds surreal, but we have much worse leadership than we had in 9/11, right? And also we've been softened up since 9/11 by the things that we gave up in 9/11, right? So we have to do better the next time around, and there will be some kind of test, whether it's a war or whether it's an act of terrorism, there will be some kind of test. And the scenario that I worry about is the one, where it's September or October of 2018. And the reason why I talk about it is not just because I'm a historian, I'm allowed to talk about anything, is that the more we talk about this, the less it's likely to work. Because there is a response to these things, which is to say, yes, we grieve, but no, we don't see this as a moment when we should be giving up our rights, on the contrary, right? Because the way this politics works is that the moment when you're grieving, someone says, now I'll be a leader, right? I mean, you go back to 9/11, like many people thought, oh, okay, George Bush is now actually not so bad, right? And that's because, we did that. Thank you for nodding, we did that. And so when in your grief, you have to be able to say, during your grief, no, you're still not a leader, right? Just because you've allowed something terrible to happen hasn't made you a leader, right? You have to be able to make that move. And to make that move, you have to think about it in advance. You have to realize, okay, something like this can happen, and when it happens, we will be protesting for our own rights. And we'll be protesting for normal elections, right? Because that's the critical thing in 2018. I'm going to end with number 19, which is be a patriot, because number 20 is one I think everyone should think about for themselves. So I'm going to read. So no, I do not have this text memorized. So number 19 is about patriotism, and it's called Be a Patriot, and I want to close by what I mean by that, because it seems to me it's very important. It's about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. A nationalist encourages us to be our worst, and then tells us that we are the best. A nationalist, although endlessly brooding on power, victory, defeat, revenge, wrote George Orwell, tends to be uninterested in what happens in the real world. Nationalism is relativist, since the only truth is the resentment we feel when we contemplate others. As the novelist Daniel Kish put it, nationalism has no universal values, aesthetic or ethical. A patriot, by contrast, wants the nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. A patriot must be concerned with the real world, which is the only place where his country can be loved and sustained. A patriot has universal values, standards by which he judges his nation, always wishing it well, and wishing that it would do better. Democracy failed in Europe in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and it is failing not only in much of Europe, but in many parts of the world today. It is that history and experience that reveals to us the dark range of our possible futures. A nationalist will say, it can't happen here, which is the first step toward disaster. A patriot says that it could happen here, but that we will stop it. Thank you. So I have 3 questions by people who brought index cards with them. 4. Okay. So I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, just raising your hand when I read your question, because I find it a little bit weird to not have the eye contact. So here's the question. Road to Unfreedom evokes Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. Is there a deliberate reference? Okay. So the road to Unfreedom, I can best answer this by saying a little bit about why I call it that. So the Road to Unfreedom in the book is about the passage from what I call the politics of inevitability to what I call the politics of eternity. Where the politics of inevitability, you might remember this is at the very end of On Tyranny, it's the way I frame Road to Unfreedom. The politics of inevitability is the idea of progress, that A leads to B, the market leads to democracy, there are no alternatives, everything's going to be fine, the future is a better version of the present, right? I'm stopping considering whether to criticize. No, okay. And then, well, no, because there's a way, that's a problem for the Democrats too. There's a way that I just put it, which sounds like it's only the Republicans, but it's also a Democratic problem, right? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I mean, I hate to say it, but it doesn't, right? It doesn't bend unless you bend it, right? So the inevitability, and then what's happening, I think, around the world is that idea is bending towards something which I call the politics of eternity, which says, forget about the future, it's politics of us and them all the time. All that ever happens is that the guilty people, the outsiders, are always at the gate, they're always threatening us. And this is Mr. Trump is a version of this with his America First and his Make America Great Again. So the idea of the Road to Unfreedom is that it's very easy to slip from believing that things are going to be okay to just giving up, right? And that can be true of people who are well off, people who are not well off, it can be true of all kinds of folks. That's the Road to Unfreedom. And then the book is a history of the 2010s where I tried to show how that's happened, or is happening from Russia to us. Now, in my little political world, individuality is very important, but individuality is created by social action. So, you know, my daughter's right over there. She's becoming an individual in part because there's a public library here, right, which is just a tiny little example of how the whole thing should work. That the only way, yeah, now everyone's trying to look at my daughter. She's wearing a white sweater. In my world, like, individuality begins with childhood, and childhood requires things that parents can't themselves do, like pensions and vacation leave and maternity leave and paternity leave and like all the things which only a government can do, basically. So you ask if it's a reference to Hayek. It is kind of, but only as sort of a way to like get conservatives to read the book. The book started out as, the book was called Origins of Unfreedom, which was meant as a reference to Hannah Arendt. And my German publisher, I think very rightly said, Road to Unfreedom sounds better. I thought, oh yeah, that's right, and maybe I'll catch a few of my conservative friends along the way. So there you go. Okay. Are you any way optimistic that we can reverse the decline in our democracy? I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. What I think, sorry, where are you? Any way optimistic person? Oh, there you are, okay. Yeah, I mean, so I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist, because optimism and pessimism are a way of seeing things. I'm a historian, and as a historian, what I think is that there's always a range of possibility. And what history does is it allows us to see what that possibility is, both for bad and for good. Right? So things can get much worse than most Americans think and much faster, and most Americans will normalize them much faster than they think they would. That's one of the things that history tells us. On the other hand, history also tells us that there's a range of action that's much broader than people realize at the time. So history is one way of kind of filling up the imaginary of things that can be done, which is what On Tyranny is trying to do. So if you're asking me, do I think it can get better? The answer is yes, I do think it can get better. But it depends on people digging in their heels and saying, you know, this history is mine, right? I'm going to do my little bit about this history, which you all are doing. So yeah, I don't in any way feel that we're doomed. Okay. Okay, wow. All right. I've reached the point where there are 2 index cards for everyone who's here. I feel like there must be a rule. Okay. So I'm gonna be a tiny bit selective because I can't. There's also a certain amount of overlap. Okay. How do we have a working 2-party system when the parties cannot compromise for the greater good? That's a really tough question. I mean, so first of all, from the point of view of how things go wrong, where are you? Even if it's not working, if we lose the second party, it's going to not work in ways that are really profound compared to the ways that it's not working now. So what your question is, the 2-party system isn't working, I get that. The 1-party system will not work in ways that are even more profound, right? So,
if I may,
yeah.
I totally agree with
Yeah.
you, but in order to move forward,
Yeah.
something has to give. I mean, I'm a liberal, right? But I don't want a country ruled by liberals because they sometimes lose track of reality.
Everybody
so
does.
It's that the framework I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
How do we go forward?
So, I mean, okay, I'll try to be a little bit tactical. So the country has to be democratized. Because, so, I mean, I'm going to make a similar move to the one you just made. I would, rather than, you know, demonize the Republicans, which I'll, you know, do the other 6 days of the week, but it's Sunday. So rather than demonize the Republicans, I could say the Republican Party operates in a certain matrix of incentives, where the fact they don't, you know, elected officials make no money. They should make a lot more money. Elections should be publicly funded. They're not. They're dependent upon a certain, you know, rather small list of lobbyists who have certain particular agendas. That's all wrong. They're operating a gerrymandered system, which of course they make themselves, but the system makes it possible. You know, and on. The system has to be democratized. So as a voter, I would vote for the party which is more likely to democratize the system, because that's good not only for that party, but it's good for both parties, right? I mean, I realize this is like, I'm taking your logic now to a kind of extreme, but one has to rescue the Republicans from the situation that they've got themselves in. Because the situation they've got themselves in is they actually are disincentivized to compete on policy. The main way they can compete is by making the system less democratic, right? That's kind of where we are, right? And so if we don't demonize them or like demonize conservatism, I think there are a lot of good things in conservatism personally, but if we don't like say it's all about ideology and say it's mainly structure, we're all imperfect, it's mainly structure, which I take it as part of your premise, then you think, okay, which party would actually be more likely to democratize the structure? And then you democratize the structure, and then maybe the two parties will function better together at some later point. That's as well as I can do on that. Okay, explain how high school violence indicates the government is not the government. It's a great question. So, I mean, it goes back to some of the basic sociology of what a rule of law state is, that the government exercises, the government aspires to exercise a monopoly on the legal use of violence, which means that you expect that when violence is used, this is an ideal, right? I'm not saying the United States is like this, but and certainly our mass incarceration system is a big example of how we're not like this. But the idea is that if violence is used, it's being used lawfully on behalf of the state. So every time there's an episode of mass violence, it's not just that it's terrifying, it's also that it demonstrates that the state is dysfunctional. Because the state should, especially in a public place like a public school, the state should be somehow in control, right? Where in control, of course, doesn't mean arming everybody and their sister, but in control means that you actually somehow sensibly determine who has arms and who doesn't have arms, so these things don't happen. But attacks on schools make people feel like the government doesn't work. They articulate this in different ways, whether on the left or on the right, but it creates a sense of anxiety and a sense that we're not actually sovereign. And so that's how I think it has this profound political significance. Okay, this has been asked in a bunch of different ways. Where does the communication among the citizenry fit in? People with different political, cultural, moral perspectives are losing the ability to talk with one another. Doesn't that lead to the downfall of democracy? Leading question. And what can we do? So, okay. First of all, there's the micro level things that we can do, which I'm sure a lot of y'all are already doing. Like, you spend less time on the internet and try to make that cool. When you're on the internet, flip the internet around by first going to investigative reporters, like have your own personal tribe of investigative reporters, American or otherwise, and rather than letting your feed tell you what to read, check those people first. And if they've written something, you then post that on your feed. And in that way you can flip the internet around, at least a little bit, and then what you're reading, which is actually reality because it comes from some investigator, and this doesn't actually have to be political. I mean, my criterion for this is, does that person physically move their body around and report stories, which actually eliminates 99.9999% of what we call the media, but it does then help us focus on those 2,000 or so investigative reporters who are frankly, they are our lifeline, right? I mean, without them, they're like that, they're the tube, that's the intravenous tube that's keeping us going right now. If we didn't, imagine where we would be now without the investigative reporters. We wouldn't know a thing. The Mueller investigation would be impossible, right? Many other things would be impossible. So one thing you can do is by just trying to get the people who are actually producing factuality, get them out into the larger public sphere by using the internet against itself. Some of the other things we've already talked about, which is that you try to keep contacts going even when people don't agree with you, because they don't, right? They don't agree with you. That's fine, right? I mean, you talk to your wife, she doesn't agree with you either. Everybody knows that you can't persuade anybody in one interaction. Thank you for laughing at that, by the way. No, but we all know that, right? I mean, you wouldn't expect, you don't go home and say, honey, I want to change the car insurance. And she says, oh, it doesn't work like that, right? You have to have long, sustained conversations, even with people you love, about the most banal things. So why would total strangers reverse their politics because you smile at them? They're not going to. But if you smile at them and talk to them, and you all know this, there's some chance that they'll see you as human. And that makes the us-them thing a little bit harder. Right? A little bit harder. And sometimes it means that they will then come back around. It's been my experience with Russia anyway, which I've been hating it for more than 2 years now. Then some of the people who told me that, in 2016 that there was nothing there, some of them have come back around, just because I talked to them in person or I was persistent about it. And then, I guess in the long run though here, I really think that we have to reform how the internet works. Like, this is not something that you and I are going to solve, but the internet doesn't have to work the way that it works now. It tribalizes us now because it appeals to the things that we already think. And this is true, you know, it's not quite as bad on the left as it is on the right, but basically it's bad for everybody to be told the stuff that you already think, as opposed to the stuff that someone else has gone out and tried to figure out. And this can be changed. It has to be changed, and we have to be thinking about how it can be changed. And like our anger at Russia and our anger at Silicon Valley has to be transformed into proposals about how these platforms could actually look differently. And they have to, and it can happen. I mean, the notion that the internet just has to be the way it is because of free speech makes no sense. Right? I mean, if you think that, then you have to think, well, you know, the 150 years of religious war after the printing press, that also had to happen. No, you know, we don't have 150 years this time. We've got to get this communications technology somehow sensibly sorted out so that it's reconcilable to a public sphere and reasonable dialogue. Okay. Can you clarify distinctions? Eileen, how much time do I have?
As much as you want.
No. I love the spirit, but like, okay. I'm gonna do two more. Does that seem reasonable? Okay. Could you please clarify the distinction between fascism and other forms of authoritarianism? Why do these distinctions matter? Okay, that's great. Because first of all, the word fascism, as you all know, gets thrown around a lot, just like the word communism gets thrown around a lot. And it's tempting to say, well, it gets thrown around a lot, we shouldn't use it. But frankly, fascism and communism were things in the world, and fascism still is, and so, okay. Yeah, good timing. Now this has to be the last question. But they were very important things in the world, and so we have to try to be precise about them. Fascism. So I'll just tell you my little definition of fascism. Fascism is hard to define because fascism was an anti-enlightenment, is an anti-enlightenment phenomenon. It begins from the assumption that will is more important than reason, and therefore it doesn't have to define itself, right? Like it's that, you've had the relationship with the person who never has to say like what they think because they have really strong feelings. That's fascism, right? That's the politics of fascism. Fascism says the Enlightenment was wrong, humans aren't fundamentally about reason, humans are fundamentally about will. We're about will, we're about emotion, right? That makes it hard to define, but that is actually the first principle of fascism. Things are more about will than they are about reason. And second part, the people who say that it's all about reason, those people are not really trying to help all of humanity. Those people are really trying to weaken us nations, us races. What people who say it's about reason are really conspirators who have a conspiracy. Maybe it's communist, maybe it's capitalist, but all those people who talk about reason, they're involved in a conspiracy against us, against the nation and the race. In other words, fascism says that this thing that we call globalization is a conspiracy. And therefore we have to guard ourselves against it. Third thing fascism says is that politics is about us and them. So my colleague Jason Stanley has a book coming out in a couple weeks called How Fascism Works, and the subtitle is The Politics of Us and Them, which is exactly right. Fascism says it's about the people, the real people, against the people who are not really the people. It's the us. I mean, I can do it the other way too. The real people. It's funny, isn't it? It's funny how it feels, right? That's what fascism says. It says politics is fundamentally about us and them. It's not about policy and institutions. It's about us and them. And then fascism is not about factuality. It's about myths. So fascism says the facts about the world are not very important. What's important is that you feel connected as a people, like the myth of the people, and then that you feel connected to your leader. And the connection to the leader doesn't have to do with laws, elections, institutions. It's a mystical connection. It's a trans-historical connection. So fascism isn't just a kind of extreme of right-wing authoritarianism. Fascism has a certain kind of emotional, psychological, ideological dynamic. So, I mean, it's against the rule of law and it's against democracy, as other forms of authoritarianism are, but it does have a special, especially extreme character, but also a special kind of psychological appeal. Now, is fascism coming back now? What I've been struck by is how certain parts of fascist thought and even fascist thinkers from the 20s and 30s and 40s are being revived and applied in the 21st century setting. So the idea that factuality doesn't matter has been picked up from fascists, actually, and then applied deliberately in our postmodern, internet-driven setting, right? So it doesn't mean that it's exactly the same as it was back then. I don't think it is. Back then it was much more about getting people out on the street, and now it's much more about keeping people on the couches, I think. I mean, because the politics of us and them now is interestingly very much about a virtual them, right? Where like you hate the immigrants you've never met, and you hate the black people you've never met, and you know the people who vote against Brexit are the people who don't have any immigrants in their lives, and you know that's very interesting. And it's not ironic because they have them in their lives. They're just in their lives in the form of an internet caricature of them, right? And that internet caricature is meant to make you really angry at these people who don't quite exist. And here in this country, it doesn't even have to be, you know, the other in that sense. Republicans and Democrats, right, don't marry each other anymore. And that's partly because they encounter each other. And again, this is a little bit worse on the right, but it certainly exists on the left too. They encounter each other as internet caricatures chiefly, right? If it's true that we spend an average of 10 hours and 38 minutes a day in front of screens, then of course we're spending more time with internet caricatures of the other than we are with the actual other. Anyway, that's the thing which is a little bit different about the way Fascism 2.0 works, I think, is that the us and them is largely virtual. And by the way, even the us is largely virtual, I think, because if you're spending 10 hours a day in front of the screen, then you don't actually have time to have a real world us either. No, okay. Okay, so one more question. Yeah, why do you not talk about actual networks of organizations keeping resistance going? I do, just not, I do. Why do you not talk about actual organizations? Why do you, you can't hear me because you're talking. Why do you not talk about actual organizations keeping resistance going? I do all the time. I do all the time. When I'm on radio or I'm on TV, when I'm doing anything besides talking to actual activist organizations, the very first move I make is that. Because most people are living in a very flat political and intellectual world where they don't actually see the kind of thing that you're doing now. And so I take the question as a very important one. I try really hard to say, it's not that hard to do the little something. It's not that hard to join a group or to support a group. They're out there. But I take the point, but because I'm talking to you, I'm not talking, I spent a minute talking about how great you are. It just seems like I shouldn't spend 40 minutes doing it. So you're great. And I'm trying to explain, like, what I think, so this is a moment where I think we have to bring what we got. Like, you bring what you have, and what I can bring is a little bit of history. And so what I'm trying to show is, like, why some of the things you do may matter more profoundly than is even obvious to you, and what some other things might be. But it's really, there are things about the last 2 years that are depressing. And then there are things about the last 2 years which are inspiring. And it is the list of groups that are mentioned here. Some of them I'm active in myself, and I agree completely. If it weren't for that, when right after the election, I gave this interview to a German newspaper where I said, if Americans don't do anything, there will be regime change within a year. And then the media asks me now, well, wait, why aren't we in fascism? And there's an answer to that, which is that some Americans did something. And it matters a lot that it's not what I want. As my father would say, it's B-, and not you guys, you're A+. Okay, you guys are like a long way away from being able to resist populism, I have to say. But it's not, for the country as a whole, it's a B-, right? But it's a long way from what one would wish, but it's something. And it has made a huge difference. The groups that you mentioned, sir, on this list, they have made a huge difference. And I do talk about them. Some of them I'm involved in. So, okay. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.